For 200 years, Europeans refused to eat this. They grew it in their gardens, they decorated their windowsills with it, they admired its color, its shape, its strange beauty. But eat it? Never. They called it the poison apple. They said it caused madness, fever, a slow, creeping death. And here's the terrifying part. They were almost right. Today, the tomato is the most consumed fruit on the entire planet. More tomatoes are produced globally each year than any other fruit except the banana. The tomato is the foundation of Italian cuisine, Mexican cuisine, Spanish cuisine, Greek cuisine, Indian cuisine, and about 40 others besides. Without the tomato, pizza does not exist, pasta sauce does not exist, salsa does not exist, gazpacho does not exist, shakshuka does not exist, the BLT sandwich does not exist. Ketchup, which coats every French fry in every country on earth, does not exist. Without the tomato, the modern food world is unrecognizable. And yet this fruit spent 2 centuries as one of the most feared, most misunderstood, most stubbornly rejected foods in human history. How does something go from poison apple to the most eaten fruit on earth? The answer involves ancient civilizations, colonial arrogance, aristocratic stupidity, one very brave American president, an industrial revolution, and a United States Supreme Court decision that still shapes grocery stores to this day. This is the story of the tomato. And I promise you, it is stranger than anything you expect. Before we go further, I want to ask you a question. When you think of Italian food, when you picture a steaming bowl of pasta marinara, a wood-fired pizza, a slow-cooked bolognese, what do you imagine you are eating? Italian tradition, right? Centuries of Mediterranean culture, ancient Roman recipes passed down through generations. Here's the truth. Italian food as we know it, tomato-based, red-sauced, the cuisine that defines Italy in the global imagination, is less than 300 years old. For most of Italian history, there were no tomatoes in Italy. For most of European history, there were no tomatoes in Europe at all. Tomatoes are American, not North American in the modern political sense, American in the deepest geographic sense, native to the Western continent, products of the Andes Mountains and the Mesoamerican highlands, children of a world that Europe did not know existed until 1492. Everything you associate with tomato-based European food, every pasta sauce, every pizza, every ratatouille, is the result of a collision between 2 worlds that happened just 500 years ago. And before that collision, tomatoes had already been part of human civilization for thousands of years. Just not a civilization that Europe knew about. Which raises the real question. Who were the people who first cultivated the tomato? How did they eat it? What did it mean to them? And what happened when the world they had built over millennia was destroyed and their food was carried away to be misunderstood, feared, and eventually reinvented by the people who had conquered them? That is the story we are actually telling here. The tomato is not just a food, it is a document, a record of conquest and loss and accidental beauty. Let us read it from the beginning. The story of the tomato begins not in a kitchen, but in a mountain. Specifically in the Andes mountain range of South America, the long, dramatic spine of rock and ice that runs the length of the western continent, from the tropical highlands of what is now Peru and Ecuador down toward Patagonia. Here, at elevations between 2,000 and 3,000 meters, in a climate of sharp sunlight and cool nights, the wild ancestor of the tomato grew. It was nothing like what we eat today. The wild tomato, Solanum pimpinellifolium, is a sprawling, weedy vine. Its fruit are tiny. We are talking about berries the size of a small pea, deep red or yellow, growing in clusters, intensely flavorful but highly acidic and very small. Not the kind of thing that immediately looks like the foundation of global cuisine. But the people who lived in these mountains were extraordinary plant domesticators. Over thousands of years, through careful selection and cultivation, they had already transformed wild grasses into corn, wild tubers into potatoes, wild plants into the quinoa, amaranth, and peppers that would eventually feed the world. They saw potential in the wild tomato. And over generations, slowly, incrementally, selecting the largest fruits, the sweetest plants, the most productive vines, they began to change it. The tomato moved north with human migration. By the time it reached the warmer, lower elevations of Central America and Mexico, it had already been partially domesticated. And it was in Mexico, specifically in the region that would become known as Mesoamerica, that the tomato truly arrived. The warm climate accelerated it. The tomato grew larger, redder, meatier, more complex in flavor. And it found a civilization ready to embrace it completely. The word tomato comes from the Nahuatl word tametl. Nahuatl was the language of the Aztec Empire, the Mexica people who had built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world in the highlands of central Mexico. And in Aztec civilization, the tomato was not an afterthought. It was not a garnish. It was not a condiment. The tomato was a staple, a central ingredient, a culinary building block as fundamental to their cuisine as wheat was to Europe or rice was to Asia. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in 1519, they encountered markets unlike anything they had ever imagined. The great market at Tlaxcala, the commercial heart of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, the city that would become Mexico City, was one of the largest markets in the world at that time. Contemporary estimates suggest it served 60,000 people daily. It was larger than any market in Europe. And in that market, tomatoes were sold in abundance. The Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún described what he saw in careful detail. He wrote about the tomato sellers, vendors who specialized entirely in tomatoes. He described large tomatoes and small tomatoes, red ones and yellow ones, green ones and orange ones. He described the tomato as part of sauces, stews, and combinations with chili peppers that were the foundation of Aztec cooking. The Aztecs made something they called salsa, not in the modern commercial sense, but sauces of crushed tomatoes, chili, and other ingredients ground on a stone called a metate. They made tomato-based stews with turkey, with squash, with beans. They understood flavor combinations that would take Europe another 2 centuries to stumble toward. The Aztec cuisine that the Spanish encountered was sophisticated, complex, and deeply delicious. The tomato was at its heart. And when the Spanish conquered Mexico, when Tenochtitlan fell in 1521 and the Aztec Empire was destroyed, they packed the tomato into their ships along with the gold and the silver and the enslaved people and the other resources they had plundered. They brought it back to Europe. And Europe had absolutely no idea what to do with it. The tomato arrived in Spain sometime around 1540. And the reaction was immediate and decisive. Europe did not eat it. Not right away, not for a very long time. To understand why, you have to understand something about the botanical world of 16th century Europe. The tomato belongs to the family Solanaceae, the nightshade family. And in 16th century Europe, nightshade was synonymous with death. The nightshade family includes some of the most toxic plants in the European botanical tradition. Deadly nightshade, belladonna, was used as a poison and a poison antidote. It was associated with witches, with dark magic, with murder. Mandrake, another nightshade, was believed to scream when pulled from the ground and drive anyone who heard it mad. Henbane, another nightshade, caused hallucinations and death. When European botanists examined the tomato plant for the first time, they saw the nightshade family written all over it. The leaves, the flowers, the smell of the plant when you touch it, the slight stickiness of the stems. They were right to be cautious. Tomato leaves and stems do contain tomatine and other compounds that are toxic in large quantities. But the fruit is perfectly safe. European botanists did not know this. They categorized the tomato as dangerous, possibly deadly, the fruit of a poisonous family. And then they made a mistake that compounded everything. The Italian botanist Pietro Andrea Mattioli, writing in 1544, described the tomato and named it pomo d'oro, golden apple, suggesting early tomatoes in Italy may have been yellow. He placed it in his catalogue of dangerous plants and noted it was eaten in some parts of Europe, but expressed serious reservations. That description set the template. For the next 200 years, European botanical literature treated the tomato with deep suspicion. But there was another reason Europeans were slow to embrace the tomato, a reason that had less to do with science and more to do with class. In the 16th and 17th centuries, wealthy Europeans ate from pewter plates. Pewter is an alloy that contains significant amounts of lead. When you place highly acidic food on a lead-containing surface, the acid leaches the lead out of the metal and into the food. The tomato is one of the most acidic fruits in nature. Wealthy Europeans who ate tomatoes from their pewter tableware experienced something alarming: stomach cramps, nausea, illness, sometimes worse. They died, and they did not understand why. They looked at the tomato, they looked at their sick guests, they drew the obvious conclusion. The tomato was poisonous. The actual killer was their own cutlery, their own plates, their own status symbol made of toxic metal. But the tomato got the blame. Here is the extraordinary irony: poor Europeans ate from wooden plates. Wood does not react with acid. Poor people who ate tomatoes experienced no illness whatsoever. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, you had a situation where wealthy Europeans believed the tomato was deadly, because it was, for them, in their specific context, for reasons they did not understand, while poor people in Italy and Spain and Portugal were quietly eating tomatoes with no ill effects and finding them absolutely delicious. The aristocracy of Europe spent 2 centuries fearing a fruit that was killing them for entirely unrelated reasons. The lesson here is uncomfortable. The people with the most power, the most education, the most resources to investigate the truth were the most wrong. The people with the least power, the least status, the fewest options stumbled onto the truth simply because they had no choice. Poverty in this case was protective. Ignorance in this case was survival. While the wealthy north of Europe was terrified of tomatoes, something different was happening in the south. In Italy, in Spain, in the warmer, poorer Mediterranean regions where wooden plates were common, where the tomatoes' climate requirements were met, where the culture of fresh vegetables and olive oil created a natural context for something new, the tomato was slowly, cautiously being adopted. Spain was the first. Spain had the most direct connection to the Americas. The tomato had arrived through the Spanish colonial apparatus, and Spanish cooks in the 16th century began experimenting with it. By the late 1500s, tomatoes appeared in Spanish cookbooks. Simple preparations: tomatoes with oil, salt, and onion, the foundations of what would become gazpacho. Italy followed, slowly, cautiously, with enormous regional variation. Northern Italy, with its wealth and its pewter plates, remained suspicious. Southern Italy, Naples, Sicily, Calabria, was poor, warm, and hungry. Southern Italians adopted the tomato with pragmatic enthusiasm. The tomato grew well in the volcanic soils of the south. It produced abundantly. It was cheap. It was nutritious. It transformed a simple sauce of water and pasta into something with color and flavor and satisfaction. The great Neapolitan peasant cuisine, the cucina povera, the poor kitchen, built itself around the tomato over the 17th and 18th centuries. And out of that poverty, out of that necessity, out of that marriage between the tomato and the resourcefulness of people who had almost nothing, came some of the most beloved food traditions in human history. The pizza marinara, tomato, olive oil, garlic, oregano on flatbread was being eaten in Naples by the mid-1700s. The pizza margherita would come later, in 1889, but the concept of tomato on bread was already generations old. Pasta al pomodoro, simple, elemental, tomato, pasta, olive oil. These dishes did not come from the royal kitchens of northern Italy. They came from the streets of Naples, from the kitchens of people who could not afford meat, who needed the tomato's acidity and sweetness to make simple ingredients satisfying. The tomato was not embraced by civilization in spite of poverty. It was embraced by civilization because of it. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people never learn. When did England and the northern European countries finally start eating tomatoes? Not when botanists declared them safe, not when physicians revised their assessments. When the aristocracy stopped eating from pewter plates. By the mid-18th century, the use of pewter tableware was declining across Europe. Porcelain, bone china, and other lead-free materials were becoming more common and more affordable. As pewter disappeared from tables, the association between tomatoes and illness gradually faded. People ate tomatoes and did not get sick. The anecdotal evidence shifted. And yet the cultural resistance remained for decades more. Habits of fear are hard to break. The stigma had been encoded in medical literature, in popular belief, in social custom. It took individual acts of public courage to fully break it. In 1820, a man named Robert Gibbon Johnson stood on the steps of the Salem courthouse in New Jersey and ate a tomato. In public, in front of a crowd. The story, told and retold in American folklore, holds that hundreds of people had gathered to watch, certain he would collapse and die on the spot. Physicians stood by. The crowd held its breath. Johnson ate the tomato, and then he ate another one. He survived. The crowd reportedly was stunned. Now, historians debate how dramatic this moment truly was. By 1820, tomatoes were already being eaten in some parts of the American South and in immigrant communities. The performance was perhaps more theatrical than genuinely brave. But the symbolism was real. The tomato needed a public champion. It needed someone willing to eat it in full view of the skeptics. And once the fear was broken, once the cultural permission was granted, the adoption was extraordinarily rapid. Within 20 years, tomatoes were being grown and eaten across the United States. Within 50 years, they had become fundamental to American cooking. The fear had lasted 200 years. The transition, once it began, took less than a generation. Now we need to talk about something that is going to strike you as absurd. And then, as you think about it more, deeply revealing about how human societies work. In 1887, the United States government decided to impose a tariff on imported vegetables. Not fruits, vegetables. A New York importer named Nix had been bringing tomatoes in from the Caribbean. The port authorities classified the tomato as a fruit because botanically it is a fruit and therefore not subject to the vegetable tariff. The government disagreed. They wanted their money. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in 1893, in the case of Nix v. Hedden, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that for purposes of trade and tariff law, the tomato was a vegetable. Not because of biology, not because of botany, but because of how it was used. The court's reasoning was essentially this: common people, when they think of vegetables, think of things eaten with dinner and the main course. Common people, when they think of fruit, think of things eaten as dessert. The tomato is eaten with dinner. Therefore, for legal and commercial purposes, the tomato is a vegetable. The Supreme Court of the United States made a ruling on the botanical identity of a fruit based on dinner table customs. And that ruling still technically stands. The tomato is legally a vegetable in the United States. Botanically, it is a fruit, specifically a berry, more closely related to the blueberry than to any vegetable. We live in a world where a 130-year-old Supreme Court ruling about import tariffs determines how most people categorize their food. This is not a minor curiosity. It is a window into how law, culture, commerce, and biology interact in ways that are far more complicated than they appear. The tomato, as always, sits exactly at the intersection of all the categories we create to make sense of the world, and refuses to fit neatly into any of them. Now let us talk about ketchup. Because the history of ketchup is one of the strangest, most convoluted food stories ever told. Ketchup as we know it, the thick, sweet, slightly tangy tomato condiment in the red bottle, is an American invention from the late 19th century. But ketchup did not begin as a tomato product. It began as something completely different. The word ketchup in various spellings, catsup, ketchup, comes from a Chinese or Malay word, kitsayup or kikap, referring to a fermented fish sauce that was popular in Southeast Asia. British sailors encountered this sauce in the 17th and 18th centuries in the ports of China and Malaysia. They loved it. They brought the concept home. But when British cooks tried to recreate the sauce, they did not have the specific ingredients, so they improvised. British versions of ketchup in the 18th century were made from mushrooms, walnuts, anchovies, oysters, almost anything that could be fermented into a salty, savory, concentrated liquid. Mushroom ketchup was particularly popular in Britain for decades. You can still buy it today. Tomato ketchup entered the picture only in the early 19th century in the United States. American cooks began experimenting with tomatoes as a ketchup base, and tomato ketchup recipes started appearing in cookbooks from around 1812 onward. But early tomato ketchup was nothing like the product we know today. It was thin, watery, highly perishable. It spoiled rapidly. It varied enormously in flavor and consistency. The transformation of ketchup into a global condiment happened through industrialization, specifically through the work of Henry John Heinz. Henry J. Heinz founded his condiment company in 1869. He did not invent ketchup, but he industrialized it. He used ripe tomatoes, much riper than previous producers had used. He increased the sugar and vinegar content, which both improved flavor and acted as natural preservatives. He developed consistent production methods that produced a reliable, shelf-stable product. And then he did something revolutionary for the time. He sold it in a clear glass bottle so buyers could see exactly what they were getting. In an era when food adulteration was rampant, when companies routinely added artificial colorings, thickeners, fillers, and genuinely toxic preservatives to extend shelf life and cut costs, a manufacturer willing to show you exactly what was in the bottle was making a powerful statement about quality and trust. Heinz ketchup became synonymous with reliability, with purity, with the idea that you could trust what you were eating. By 1905, Heinz was producing 12 million bottles of ketchup per year. By the end of the 20th century, ketchup was being consumed in virtually every country on Earth. The tomato had completed its journey from Andean wild berry to global institution. And yet the industrial success of the tomato came with costs that we are still reckoning with today. Let us talk about the modern tomato. To understand what happened to the tomato in the 20th century, you have to understand the economics of scale. When a food becomes popular enough to need industrial-scale production, the criteria for growing it change completely. Home gardeners and small farmers grow tomatoes for flavor, for the experience of eating something extraordinary. Industrial producers grow tomatoes for something else entirely: yield, durability, uniformity, shelf life. An industrial tomato needs to survive being harvested by machine without bruising. It needs to survive days or weeks of refrigerated transport. It needs to look identical to every other tomato in the batch. It needs to fit neatly into boxes and stack without damage. Flavor is not on that list. Starting in the 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s, the American tomato industry made a series of decisions that collectively transformed the tomato from one of the most flavorful foods in the world into something that many food critics describe as a red ball of water. Breeders selected for thick skin, better for machine harvesting; for uniformity of shape and size, better for packaging; for the ability to be picked while still green and then gassed with ethylene to turn red during transport, better for shelf life. They bred out the compounds that made tomatoes taste like tomatoes. The chemicals responsible for the complex, umami-rich, deeply satisfying flavor of a ripe garden tomato are produced primarily when the tomato is fully ripe on the vine. Industrial tomatoes never reach that stage on the vine. They are picked early, gassed, and turned red artificially. The color is tomato, the nutritional profile is roughly tomato. But the flavor is a ghost of what a tomato should be. A food scientist named Harry Klee at the University of Florida has spent years studying what makes a tomato taste like a tomato. His research identified specific volatile compounds, aroma chemicals, that are responsible for the characteristic tomato flavor. He found that modern commercial tomato varieties had been bred unintentionally to produce significantly less of these compounds than older varieties. The tomato had been optimized out of its own identity. Here is the comparison that makes this tangible. A tomato grown in a home garden, ripened fully on the vine, picked and eaten immediately. That tomato can have a sugar content of 4 to 8%, a complex aroma profile of over 400 volatile compounds, and a flavor experience that is simultaneously sweet, acidic, earthy, and intensely savory. A supermarket tomato picked green and gassed 2 to 3% sugar, a fraction of the volatile compounds, a flavor that is flat, watery, and barely recognizable as the same plant. We industrialized the most flavorful vegetable in the Western culinary tradition and turned it into something that required ketchup to taste like itself again. There is a certain painful irony in that. But something is changing. The last 2 decades have seen a quiet revolution in tomato culture. Heirloom tomatoes, varieties that predate the industrial era, varieties that were kept alive by home gardeners and small farmers who cared more about flavor than shelf life, have made a comeback. Walk into any farmer's market today and you will see them. Brandywine tomatoes, with their large, irregular shapes and extraordinarily complex flavor. Black Krim tomatoes from the Crimean Peninsula, deep brownish red with a smoky, almost wine-like taste. Green zebra tomatoes, striped yellow and green, tart and bright. Cherokee purple, a Tennessee heirloom with a flavor that experienced tomato growers describe as the closest thing to the original wild tomato experience. These varieties were almost lost in the rush to industrialize in the decades when commercial production dominated and supermarket uniformity was the only thing that mattered. Hundreds of tomato varieties fell out of use. They survived because of people who refused to let them go. Seed savers, often elderly farmers and gardeners, often in rural areas, often people whose connection to traditional food practices was personal and familial rather than commercial, saved seeds year after year. When the food movement of the late 20th century created new demand for flavor and variety, those seed savers had something extraordinary to offer. The heirloom tomato movement is, in a small but real way, an act of cultural recovery. The recovery of flavor knowledge, the recovery of variety, the recovery of a relationship with food that industrial agriculture had nearly erased. The comparison between a supermarket tomato in December and a farmer's market heirloom tomato in August is not a subtle one. It is as dramatic as the difference between a fast food burger and a meal prepared by a great chef. They share the same name. They are barely the same food. Let us also talk about where tomatoes are grown today and what that tells us about the global economy. The tomato is now the second most consumed fresh vegetable globally and the most processed. China is the largest producer of fresh tomatoes in the world, accounting for roughly 35% of global production. Italy is the largest producer of processed tomatoes, tomato paste, tinned tomatoes, passata, and has been for decades. The tomato processing industry in southern Italy is worth billions of euros and employs hundreds of thousands of people. California's San Joaquin Valley produces nearly 95% of all processed tomatoes in the United States. The harvest is almost entirely mechanized. Enormous machines travel through the fields, stripping the vines of all their fruit simultaneously. The tomatoes are fed directly into trucks that carry them to processing plants within hours. This system produces tomato paste and tomato sauce at a scale and efficiency that would have been incomprehensible to a 19th century canner. But it depends on a monoculture system, vast fields of a small number of highly standardized varieties, that carries all the risks we now understand monocultures to carry. Vulnerability to disease, vulnerability to climate, vulnerability to the failure of a single point in a tightly optimized system. There are roughly 10,000 known varieties of tomato. The industrial system relies on perhaps a dozen. The difference between those numbers is the difference between resilience and fragility. The story of the banana, where a monoculture was destroyed by a single fungus, is not a story unique to bananas. Any monoculture carries that risk, and the tomato, for all its abundance today, is more fragile than it appears. Now versus then. In Aztec Mexico, tomatoes were part of a cuisine that used hundreds of varieties: small cherry tomatoes, large beefsteaks, yellow varieties, orange varieties, varieties with specific flavor profiles suited to specific dishes. The market at Tlatelolco sold them all. In a modern supermarket, you will typically find four: the vine tomato, the cherry tomato, the Roma tomato, the beef tomato. 4 options from a universe of 10,000. In terms of flavor, the contrast is even starker. The Aztec cooks who ground fresh tomatoes with chili on a stone metate, who made sauces from tomatoes picked ripe from the vine that morning, who combined them with fresh herbs and roasted squash seeds. They were working with a flavor intensity that we barely encounter today unless we grow our own. We have more tomatoes than any civilization in history. We eat them year-round. We have them in every processed food imaginable, in soups, in sauces, in crackers, in condiments, in ready meals. But in terms of actual flavor, in terms of the quality of the tomato-eating experience, the Aztec market seller had something we do not. The food abundance of the modern world and the food quality of the ancient world are not the same thing. They are sometimes in opposition. What does the history of the tomato teach us? Let me give you a few answers, not agricultural facts, real transferable lessons. The first is about fear and categories. The tomato was feared for 200 years because it belonged to the wrong family. It was a nightshade, and nightshades were dangerous. This was true, and it was also a catastrophic oversimplification. The tomato family contains deadly plants and edible ones. The category of nightshade captured a real danger and then overgeneralized it to the point of absurdity. A fruit that fed millions of people in the Americas for thousands of years was rejected by an entire continent because it was associated with a category that implied danger. How often do we do this in our own lives? We associate a person with a group. We associate an idea with an ideology. We associate a food, a place, a style of thinking with a category that carries emotional weight, and we reject the individual thing because of what the category feels like. The tomato is a reminder that categories are tools for understanding, not substitutes for it. The tool serves you until it doesn't. And the moment you let the category think for you instead of thinking for yourself, you are standing outside the tomato's garden for 200 years, convinced that something magnificent is trying to kill you. The second lesson is about who gets to be right. The European aristocracy, the educated, the powerful, the well-resourced, were wrong about tomatoes. They had the authority to declare the tomato dangerous, and they used that authority, and they were wrong. The poor of Naples, the peasants of southern Spain, the laborers in the fields. They ate the tomato, they were right. Correctness and authority are not the same thing. This is one of the most important distinctions in human intellectual history, and the tomato teaches it so clearly that it is almost funny. Almost. The third lesson is about what we lose when we optimize. The industrial tomato is a miracle of logistics. It is cheap, abundant, uniform, and available everywhere. It has made a nutritious food accessible to billions of people who could not otherwise afford fresh produce. These are genuine goods. But in achieving them, we made decisions, thousands of small, incremental decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, that collectively stripped the tomato of its flavor, of its variety, of its connection to the places and cultures that created it. We optimized for what we could measure, yield, shelf life, uniformity, and lost what we could not easily measure, taste, diversity, richness. This pattern appears everywhere in modern life. We optimize for metrics, and metrics only capture what we already know how to count. The things that matter most, flavor, beauty, meaning, joy, resist quantification. And systems that optimize only for what can be quantified will, over time, quietly eliminate the things that cannot. The tomato that arrived from the Andes to the Aztec kitchen, to the Naples slum, to the global market, and then to the industrial processing plant lost something at every step where efficiency was prioritized over experience. The question is whether we choose to notice, and whether, having noticed, we choose to care. A few extraordinary facts to carry with you. The tomato contains more lycopene, a powerful antioxidant linked to reduced risk of heart disease and certain cancers, when it is cooked than when it is raw. Eating the tomato breaks down cell walls and releases the lycopene in a form the body can absorb more easily. The Italians, who spent centuries making slow-cooked tomato sauce, were accidentally optimizing for nutrition long before anyone understood why. The Spanish city of Buñol holds an annual festival called La Tomatina, in which participants throw approximately 150 tons of overripe tomatoes at each other in the streets. It began in 1945 when a group of young men started throwing tomatoes from a market stall during a parade. It has grown into one of the most famous food festivals in the world. Every year, the streets of Buñol run red. The term heirloom tomato has no legal definition. Any grower can label any tomato as heirloom. The word signals intent, a commitment to older varieties, open-pollinated seeds, flavor over uniformity, but it carries no regulatory weight. As the heirloom market has grown, so has the use of the label for tomatoes that do not genuinely belong to it. The state vegetable of New Jersey is the tomato. This is because New Jersey was historically one of the most important tomato-growing states in the early American canning industry. The Campbell Soup Company, founded in New Jersey in 1869, was instrumental in developing the commercial canned tomato industry. The tomato is botanically classified as a berry. Under strict botanical definition, a berry is a fleshy fruit developed from a single flower with one ovary. The tomato qualifies. The strawberry, by contrast, is not technically a berry at all. It is what botanists call an accessory fruit. The world produces roughly 180 million metric tons of tomatoes per year. If you stacked those tomatoes, the tower would reach approximately 18 million kilometers into space, roughly 47 times the distance from the Earth to the Moon. We began with a question. How does something go from poison apple to the most eaten fruit on Earth? Now you know the full answer. It went through ancient mountain valleys in the Andes, carried by birds and then by human hands. It was cultivated over thousands of years into something extraordinary by people whose names we will never know. It was the foundation of a cuisine in a civilization that the conquistadors dismantled and plundered and partially erased. It crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a ship, arriving in a world that had no idea what to make of it. It spent 200 years being feared by the educated and quietly embraced by the poor. It was redeemed not by scientists but by necessity, not by knowledge but by hunger, not by those with power but by those without it. It was declared a vegetable by a Supreme Court that needed the tariff revenue. It was transformed into a global condiment through industrial chemistry and clever marketing. It was industrialized, optimized, stripped of flavor, and partially recovered by gardeners who cared more about taste than efficiency. And throughout all of it, through conquest and fear and poverty and law and industry and revolution, it was the same fruit. The same wild, acidic, brilliantly red, improbably delicious fruit that grew in the Andean foothills 10,000 years ago. It did not change. We changed around it. Every generation encountered the tomato and made of it what that generation needed. The Aztecs made it into the foundation of a sophisticated cuisine. The Italians made it into the symbol of a cuisine that would define their national identity. The Americans made it into a condiment that went around the world. And now we are making it into a metaphor. A metaphor for how we treat the things we love when we try to scale them, when we try to make them available to everyone, everywhere, all at once. What do we keep? What do we lose? What do we owe to the original, to the people who first understood it, to the wild form that produced it, to the flavor that made it worth fighting over in the first place? The tomato asks these questions simply by existing. By sitting there on your counter, red and round and completely ordinary, waiting to be understood. The Aztec farmer who grew tomatoes in the chinampas of Tenochtitlan, the floating gardens in the lake that surrounded the greatest city in the Americas, did not know that the fruit they were tending would one day be eaten by 8 billion people. They did not know their city would be destroyed, their civilization dismantled, their culinary traditions scattered across the world in the hands of the people who conquered them. They did not know that the sauce they made fresh each morning, tomatoes, chili, herbs, ground on stone, would eventually travel to Naples, be combined with pasta, and become the most imitated cuisine in human history. They simply grew good food. With knowledge accumulated over hundreds of generations, with respect for the plant, with attention to the soil and the season and the subtle differences between one variety and another. They did not need a Supreme Court ruling to know what they were eating. They did not need a grocery store label. They did not need a food writer to tell them it was heirloom. They just knew. Because they were paying attention. And maybe the most important thing the tomato can teach us, across all of its 500 years of collision with the Western world, across all its transformations and misrepresentations and reinventions, is the value of that attention. Pay attention to what you eat, where it comes from, what it cost to get here, who grew it first, and what they knew about it that we have forgotten. The ordinary things on your kitchen counter are not ordinary. They are the final stop in journeys that began before your country existed, before your language existed, before the world you were born into had taken its current shape. Pay attention to what you are eating, because what you are eating is history. And history is trying to tell you something.